Welcome to an episode of the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm here with Nathan Dohse. Nathan, say hello.
Hello.
Nathan is an educator. He's an advocate. He's a speaker in the music industry. He's in the Nashville area. Today we're talking about breaking our echo chambers and sacrificing our sacred cows. So I invited Nathan to join me on the podcast because he interacted with me on one of the political posts that I had done on Facebook. And I wanted to read his comment because I think that's going to set the stage for this conversation. So I'm going to read the comment and then I'm going to throw it to you, Nathan, to explain what is it you mean by this and what's been your sort of your perspective of this situation. So in response to, I believe it was when I came out about being a Republican for Harris. The Republicans for Harris as a coalition came together, and I posted about it. And so you said, this breaks the echo chamber, if nothing else. It creates cognitive dissonance within a community, which does more good than anything else you could possibly do. We do not have a responsibility or the right to change anyone else's mind, but we do have the responsibility to use our minds we have and to encourage others to do the same. You are doing a great job of that. So talk to me, what is it? Why'd you post that? What do you mean by this? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've been thinking a lot about thought leadership versus like following along and taking in information. And I've been studying it a little bit. When I say studying, I mean really skimming the top of a lot of different articles because I can't get all the way through any single article too deeply. But I've just been thinking a lot about this, and it's really funny to me because in the both sides, right? We talk about both sides call each other sheep all the time. Right? Just sheep, and everybody's a sheep, meaning everybody's going along. And so in that, I think cognitive dissonance, creating something that is going against the direction of the flow and just dropping it in of like, hey, this exists. This is real. This is happening. Republicans for Harris is a coalition of people that have come together, and it's happening. And the people that are a part of that coalition are a bunch of people that, you know, have followers who previously were for Trump. And so now the fact that this just happened and it's out in the world, everybody has to at least ponder and grapple with and decide where they're going to fall. Because this person might be somebody that I used to take what they said as gold or really follow what they said. And now I can't. And so what am I going to do with that? So it's the only way. We can't change people's minds. We can't argue with people. And, you know, when we argue our points and we go 100 comments deep on a Facebook post, you're never going to end up changing that person's mind. But introducing new information and them having to place it themselves, they might come to a new conclusion. So within the echo chambers, whenever I'm in what some would call a Facebook debate, I'm not actually debating the person trying to change their mind. I know that in this digital space and in the comment section, there are many people who are just reading along, right? They're reading, and they might be reading along because somebody that they usually listen to is the one commenting. Maybe that's the person that I'm arguing with. Maybe they have disagreed with that person in the past, but not said anything about it. And now I'm giving the counter argument to the thing that they've heard that person say over and over and over again. But they've never actually heard the counter argument, at least not in a cordial or well-articulated way. Maybe they've heard it screamed at somebody or something. But to sit there, and so I'll have that conversation, and sometimes people will chime in and say, oh, that's pointless. It's like, well, it's not pointless to the person who's reading and following along. And so I know that one comment will sit in there and just kind of worm away in somebody's brain and be like, I haven't thought about it that way. And that cognitive dissonance of like, hey, this is true, this is happening, and now you have to hold it and you have to deal with it. Like, what does it mean that Liz Cheney is is campaigning for Harris? Is okay, you have to sit with that. Dick Cheney, you have to sit with that, like, what does this mean? So I think that's what I meant by that comment.
All right, so the first thing you said is this breaks the echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me about how do you think about echo chambers, and why is it a problem? Is it a problem?
That's interesting. Is it a problem? Not always. I think that we have so much information coming into us all the time that we probably couldn't handle if we were actually giving everything the time of day. I don't know that we would actually be able to handle it.
Yeah.
And so the echo chamber, we live in a world of algorithms, right? So you're getting a lot of your information, everything, all the information that you're getting now is pretty much funneled through an algorithm one way or another, except for if you're still on cable television, but then that's subjective media based off of the people that control each station. So you're getting everything from an algorithm. So I think what I mean by your post is that from knowing you and your community, the folks who are getting information from your algorithm are usually getting something different from you, or something more in line with their thought and their thinking, and then you go, here's this, and it's not what they expected. So the only people who can break an echo chamber are in the echo chamber. They have to be in it to begin with.
Yeah.
To break it.
Yeah.
Which is hard to do these days. It's hard to be in shared spaces.
Yeah. Well, and I guess so then, in terms of our societal situation, kind of parlay that to like, why does it matter in terms of our politics, and who we're voting for, and this giant election that's looming over our country?
Yeah. Oh man, we're under 30 days. Yeah. I think that how it plays out in real life is, especially in certain environments regionally, you come to some assumptions of how people are going to think. And so, for example, my wife is a hairstylist, and she's grown up in the South. She's grown up here in the Nashville area. And, growing up, she'd be cutting hair, and people would come in and start saying stuff that she just really disagreed with and would find offensive.
Yeah.
But they just assumed about her that because of the environment that she thought a certain way, or they just had the entitlement to just talk about whatever they wanted whenever they wanted. So what she did was she started putting pins on a jacket that just were, there's a Black Lives Matter pin, there's a pride flag, things like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
What it does when you do that is it just makes somebody go, I'm not going to talk about my opinions about that thing while this person's cutting my hair with a set of scissors right next to my ear or something. Just makes you a little bit more aware. And so I think people oftentimes call that virtue signaling, but I think it also is just it's not that. It is saying, hey. And
maybe
then
allegiance signaling.
It's allegiance signaling, but it also does something else, right? Like it minimizes the amount of, it gives that person information, because I think a lot of folks, they don't want to but they do want to be seen and heard, and they want to have conversations. So I think a lot of these, these would be clients that she's worked with for years and years, right? I don't want to tell too much of her story. That's her story. But the point, I've always liked it, is that I think it gives people information of like, oh, we disagree on that topic, and so we don't need to talk about it because they don't want to offend. But then it does a second thing too, and that is people who do agree see that pin, and they go, oh, this is a safe place for me to talk about this, right? And so I think that's maybe equally or more important, is to let people know, like, hey, this conversation we can talk about here. And in that same sense, I think that goes both ways, to where, whatever your allegiances are. But if you're doing it to try and like scare somebody, like that's where it gets a little uncomfortable, right? And so, how can you break the echo chamber? It's just by the echo chambers do exist regionally, and I think it's just like being able to say, hey, I'm a part of this space, I'm a part of this community, and I just don't think the same way that you do.
So
Okay.
Well, I think so. Part of what you're describing too is the second piece, which is the sacred cow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, they're talking about one thing, what this person is bothered by it, of which they don't know any different.
Yeah.
And you could have the flip side dynamic too, where if you do have those signals and then someone comes in and then they don't speak about it in that same way. And one of the things that reminds me of is I had this, I've been a movie extra on several movies. So there's this one movie I was on, The Founder, with Michael Keaton, which is an interesting parallel, because it's the story of McDonald's, and it's really about this horrible person that essentially steals a McDonald's from the founders. They kind of let the wolf in. There's a scene where it's like, we let the wolf in, what are we doing? And so I was on set, and this particular scene, everyone except for me and one other person was called to the set. So we were essentially waiting, and we're at the table, and he's talking, and he's doing like what you're describing, which is he's talking how he probably talks to other men, but he's talking to me that way about his girlfriend.
Yep.
And he, I think the situation was something like he wanted to bring his laptop so he could do something, and his girlfriend was supposed to put it in his bag or remind him or something, and she didn't. So he said she was an effing B.
Yeah.
Like, just, I can't believe, and I said, don't talk about your girlfriend that way. And he was like shocked.
Yeah.
Because he didn't expect that.
Yeah.
And he immediately changed. And he started actually talking differently. We actually had a really meaningful conversation, and he was a lot more respectful. And I got in that moment, like, he was talking to me because he thought I was expecting him to talk a certain way, and I wasn't that person.
Right. Yeah. I had the same situation happen yesterday in the sauna at the YMCA. It was me and two really old dudes, similar situation, not exactly the same, but similar, and one young woman. And the second she gets up to leave, these two very old men start talking locker room talk, like you would expect. And they look at me and they're like, I'm like, I do not know. And I didn't go into the place of like confronting it for a couple of reasons. But one, I think also just back to the point of like the cognitive dissonance is I'm a younger man in the sense, and so for them to be like, and for me to be like, no, cognitive dissonance. Whoa, wait, why did he respond that way? Like, why? Like, maybe he was gay or something. Wherever they go, they have to process, right? They have to process. Why didn't he respond the way we expected him to respond? And I think sometimes that's even more beneficial than the confrontation, because the confrontation puts somebody in defense. Not saying that I would have confronted that aggressively too. It was an aggressive stance. Sometimes that aggressive stance is necessary, but I like to not respond how it's expected and leave them with it. Because now they have to think of, man, that guy didn't respond how I expected him to. And so then it's they have to sit with it, and they have to try to place it. And I think that's usually where they end up going, maybe my behavior wasn't.
Yeah. It creates a mirror, I think. I had a situation, I think of that idea as being living anomalous, and being an anomaly.
Yeah.
to what they expect. And I had a situation where I had a friend who was an author, and he was being published, and he was doing some interviews in New York, and I went along with him on his trip to New York. And the gal who was interviewing, he was a Christian author, and he wrote a Christian book. And this girl's experience, or woman, she was probably like 20 something. Her experience of Christians was like very negative. Like she thought they were so bad that she wrote a screenplay about serial killing Christians. Like that was her experience. And so
it's above.
Here she is talking to my friend and me, and we're like really kind to her and respectful and listening, trying to understand her story. It was interesting because she did the interview for him for this. It was an interfaith channel of some sort, and it was like she went from like a job of interviewing him to like she was actually personally curious about this story. And we ended up like inviting her to Bible study, and she came that night. It was quite a wild experience.
That's cool. Yeah.
But we were a type of Christian that was so dramatically different than the type she had experienced, and it created exactly what you're trying to. It created that tension. Go, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So the other thing I was going to add is, back to my movie extra.
Yeah.
There's another layer I think here that we can talk about. So we end up moving to a different table, and I end up talking with this other woman, younger, probably 20s too. And we had a great conversation. We built some rapport. And the guy that I was talking with was and he was nice and respectful. Like he wasn't a jerk face. But another guy shows up at the second table. And this is the guy that the guy was probably trying to get his approval, because this guy was very cynical. He was very crude. And so it was this weird situation where he felt threatening to this woman, and I'm kind of sitting between them like, okay, I'm trying to like moderate, but unlike the other guy who was responsive to it, this guy was not. He was just going to do what he's going to do.
Yeah.
And so I just sat with her until he left, so that she wouldn't have to feel that.
Yeah, to feel that. Yeah.
So I think that's another dynamic just to think about, is kind of like what you said about the safety piece.
Yeah.
Our presence, I think, both helps people not feel alone, but also not feel unsafe. And I think for vulnerable people, that as someone who doesn't feel vulnerable, like we may not appreciate that as a man, but as a woman, they may feel that vulnerability in a way that we don't. And so to provide that that positive tension, I think is another dynamic. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it brings it back to the word that sends people, raging, and that's a privilege. It's a privilege of being a man, a male privilege, to be in spaces and feel safe majority of the time. In most situations, we feel relatively safe as men, whether that's getting pulled over by the cops or being in dark alleyways. Like, we know that the threat to us is more often than not relatively minor, as opposed to other people. And so it is a privilege that we have. And so then we can either use that privilege to create safety, or we can use it to advance our own desires and
exploit it. Yeah.
And exploit it. Or we can use it, and this is maybe the one that applies the most, to isolate ourselves, right? When we do that, we start to isolate from, okay, now we're not safe anymore. And now this whole space, because we didn't confront somebody who was behaving inappropriately, now the whole environment's not safe, right? And so now that's how an echo chamber gets created, is because there's no safety for other voices. So those voices leave, right? Those voices like dip out. And then it's just the same thing, over and over and over again. And I think that happens to men a lot. We don't create safe spaces for other voices or other types of people. And it's just the same thing. And what I think isn't really being talked about is that that's boring.
Yeah.
And
nobody wants to have those conversations.
And we're bored.
Yeah.
And so that's why, when you look at men in their 30s, they start to decline in having deep and meaningful relationships. And of course they are. When they show up to hang out with the boys, it's the same thing over and over and over again, because it's carbon copy of all the same people. So it's just the same conversation. The only thing different is who's winning the football game that week, right? And so that's why the conversations just devolve into really shallow things, and it's because it's all the same voice. And so echo chambers are creating isolation for us as well, especially for men, and it's creating loneliness. So that's and just recently I was reading about how, for all intents and purposes, they've called loneliness an epidemic.
I think the Surgeon General actually came out and said something about
right.
it.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't remember if it was a Surgeon General, but I think that's right. And so a lot of that has to do with echo chambers, and so.
Well, I think so. Let me add a couple layers there, because, I gave some examples of where I was I did the right thing and I was great, but I have so many stories where I've utterly failed, where I didn't speak up and I was a coward, and all of that. And so there's the flip side of that, and I think part of that has to do with talking about loneliness and isolation and survival. When I'm struggling, or if there's an addiction that I have, having a place of other men to talk about those things that most men are not talking about, but we need to, because they're critical. We can just decay inside if we don't. And so having that place, I think the echo chamber there's an interesting contrast between that and and even the sacred cow, in the sense of, hey, this is a group where we can talk about anything, and we're going to be able to sort of, hey, I'm struggling with this thing. And there isn't sort of any, well, we don't talk about that thing. We talk about, if you're struggling with this, if you're facing this challenge, this is a place to be vulnerable and to work that out, so that we can move from being unhealthy to being healthy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I have a space like that. I have a recovery group that I go to. We call it Men's Heart Group. It's associated with my church, but my church is progressive Christian, so it kind of stands kind of alone in the Nashville area already. And so this men's group is really great. I would say a decent portion are gay men, which is amazing to have in the community, because right there it's different voices. And we have a lot of values that we hold that I think, I mean, we grew up in the same area and had a lot of intersection in our youth groups and things like that. But one of the first things I learned when we started this group was no religious platitudes and no fixing, no crosstalk. Right, in AA, there's no crosstalk. This isn't an AA group, but it uses some of the same structure. And so no fixing was and no platitudes. And what that looks like is, when somebody shares their experience, you're not saying oh, well, God has a plan. Well, that's not helping me right now in this moment. Right. And one of the things that we say in the group is, when we don't know what to say, we give ourselves permission to sit quietly with each other. As somebody who's ADHD and a loud voice and a speaker and all that, sitting quietly together, I hate it. So it really was something to sit and learn and be like, do I actually have something valuable to say? or am I uncomfortable in the silence? I think about that too in when we're in spaces where people are inappropriate or things like that. Back to that story in the sauna, is that being uncomfortable in the silence, it has a lot of value too. I really measure. I used to get into confrontations a lot more than I actually do now, of like, well, you shouldn't say that or whatever. And I really measure and I go, is what I'm going to say going to create a difference, or is sitting here quietly going to have the larger impact? And but in that space, nothing's off the table. We talk about whatever's going on, and there's no fixing. And it's amazing to see how men what I love about this group too, it's the only group that I've ever been in that's like this, but we have somebody who I think is 70, and then our youngest member is 24.
Okay.
I don't think I've ever been a part of a group that has that wide of a age gap. And it's amazing. I think every other one that I've ever been a part of, older men felt like they had to be wise or something, they were in some sort of leadership or something with it. And it's amazing to have the men who are quite a bit older than me be vulnerable and show that they don't, they don't have it all going on, and and they don't know how to handle things, and they struggle with stuff and all that stuff. So it's cool. It's important. We need more spaces like that, I think.
Yeah. So let's talk about the cognitive dissonance within a community. How do you, I think of the Seinfeld episode where George is dating the gal that looks like Jerry. It's like, don't they look alike? And like the whole episode, it's like irritating him. And then at the end, he's like, I can't do this anymore. He finally accepts the reality, and he decides to break up with her because the cognitive dissonance was too much.
I can't.
Talk to us about that.
I'll give an example back to my church and my faith journey. I'm a Christian that's affirming of LGBTQ, and I I believe they're Christians and part of our community, and I affirm their right to have a relationship and be, exactly who they are. And when I talk about that, and especially on the internet, people are like, you're not a Christian, right? And I go, no, I am. And they list all the reasons as to why I'm not a Christian. There's all the reasons why you're not a Christian. Now I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian because I know what I believe it means to be a Christian. And then I know what they believe that it means to be a Christian. And so then I reiterate our shared beliefs.
Yeah.
Right here. No, hold on. Isn't this what we believe makes us a Christian? Isn't that what we've been taught? Well, I believe those things. Well, here's this one thing that you don't believe. And because of that, I'm going to hang on to it and say, you're not a Christian. Right. So that's this voice. And I go, no. And that is the space where if we can hold power in our own identity and only speak for ourselves and hold our own power and not even try to fight to change somebody's mind, like, I'm going to keep calling myself a Christian. Clearly you won't, but that's okay. You can do that, but you don't get to tell me that that I'm not. And so in that, people just have to sit with it and just they can double down, but eventually once they've heard that story more than once, and okay, now there's more folks that believe the way Nathan does, and now they've heard it before, the next time they hear it, it's not the first time they've heard it, and they've had to sit with it a little bit longer, and these things just bounce around in our heads. And some people kick them out and they just completely tune it out, and they get the way that they view the world and hide it.
Dismiss it.
Yeah. dismiss it and find some confirmation bias. I think is the number one thing that happens in that, right? Like if you're dealing with cognitive dissonance, you go, oh, I know this to be true. You go look for something that confirms what you want to believe, right? So confirmation bias in conjunction with cognitive dissonance. Confirmation bias is the only way to get out of cognitive dissonance, right? Is to go find something that affirms what you want to believe to be true about the world. So, and I think a big piece of that is emotional vulnerability. And I think this comes back to where men have a long way to go, is that if I can communicate, hey, what you said made me sad, and I'm vulnerable and I've shared my information. What you said made me sad.
Yeah.
Well, what I said wasn't wrong. I didn't say what you said was wrong. I said it made me feel sad. Mm. Well, you shouldn't feel that way. I can't really do anything about the way that I feel. What you said made me sad. Were you saying I should have said something different? No, I'm not. And so then the person has to sit with, okay, this person's sad, and you see the just friction that's like, they don't want that to be true. You know?
Yeah, I think of that scene in Lord of the Rings when the Balrog is trying to cross and Gandalf's standing there like, you shall not pass. And it's just two powerful forces, just all this friction, but nothing's happening. It's just stuck. Mm-hmm. Who's going to budge?
Oftentimes we don't have the we want to fight, and that creates, we both dig our heels in and we want to argue. But if we get vulnerable and we just say like, oh man, that may, like, I'm angry right now, like instead of being like, you're wrong and you're stupid and you snowflake or whatever, just like, hey, when people speak this way, it makes me really angry.
Yeah.
Right. And you're not showing anger. You're not raging. You're not fighting. You're giving information that says, I'm really angry. And people don't know what to do with that because they're used to your behavior matching it. And then they have to defend themselves. And they know how to defend themselves, but people don't like to have people mad at them. Right. No one does. Yeah. You don't like to have people mad at you. So when you go, that made me really angry with you.
Well, and I've noticed, I had this interesting experience in high school where this kind of bully kid we were messing around in class and he kind of took it too far and he hit me and like it really hurt. And he felt guilty about it. And he said, hit me back. Like he needed me to hit him back to help feel better about it. I said, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And it really, really, really bothered him. But I think what you're describing is that dynamic. And I think Christ in his passion experience is just such a beautiful example of that, where, all of these wretched, horrible lies and terrible things are done to him at one after the next. And he could have responded in wrath in any number of ways, and he didn't. Yeah. And in fact, several of the cases, he says, forgive them for they know not what they do. I mean, he did the opposite in several situations. Yep. So that's kind of what comes to my mind.
Well, actually, take that even to what we know about that story. There was an army of people that expected him to do that.
Yeah. Peter and Judas being two of them.
So that is the echo chamber. That is what we need to be doing. Is there's this expectation of how we will respond from the people who are with us.
Yeah.
Right. Like it was his followers were like, okay, now it's time for the sword. Now we're going to like, now's when he's going to bring it. And it's time for us to go to war.
And that was also similar with Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
He was such a conviction about his peaceful participation. But there were people in his group that were like doing that. And he said, no, this is what we're doing.
Yeah,
and
I believe it might be TV history for me, but I mean I think that was the big conflict and disagreement between
but it created
Malcolm X.
Yeah, from what I understand. But it created, as people watched on TV, these peaceful, the Black community being peaceful, and then violence being put on them. It created a picture that if they've been fighting each other, America may not have responded the same way. But and so from just a empirical approach to protesting, it actually made it created that cognitive dissonance. People had to wrestle with that as it bounced around in their head.
And it's funny when taking it back to Christ, how much you can say something to people, how many times you can tell somebody who you are and what you're about, and they won't believe it. I mean, how many times did he say, greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for a friend, right? Mm-hmm. And then they're like, but you're not going to do that. You're not going to actually let them.
It's like none of it made sense until it was all over.
Yeah. And then he's like, I've been telling you guys. Like, I've been saying this is what's going to happen. And they're like, but surely, no, it won't. And I think that's where we kind of
put our own hopes and dreams. We overlay the reality.
Yeah. And so when we're having these conversations and we exist, I can walk into a locker room. I can walk into any locker room, and when I say locker room, I mean the real one and the metaphorical one, right? And be around men, and I can laugh at I'll laugh at a couple of the jokes that are like, yeah, that's not appropriate, but it's funny. Yeah. And so I'll laugh.
Yeah.
And I don't have to make every single situation uncomfortable. And I also don't feel guilty for laughing at something that's funny, but crude and not appropriate. And so I think there's this place where it's like it's no, like reading the room, knowing the opportunities, and I'm in there like I'm not trying to change the locker room. I'm looking for the other person. I'm looking for the person in the locker room that seems a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right. That's going, oh man, I don't belong here. This isn't, I'm uncomfortable with this. And I'm trying to just be a bridge to that person before they assimilate and compress whatever it is, right? Before they compartmentalize whatever it is about them that makes them uncomfortable, and tuck it away. And because that's when they start to suffer trauma. When they compartmentalize whatever makes them different to assimilate to the group. And so I'm just trying to be a bridge that goes like, hey, I can be in this group, but I'm not like this group. And I think on my own, and I think differently.
An escape hatch.
And I think the best way to do that is just like ask questions and get to know people and just stay curious about people. And I find that's interesting too. So when you take it back to like politics, in the echo chamber of politics, we live in a rural area right outside of Nashville called Pegram, and it's conservative, relatively, And so again, my wife with her, and I'm all about this too, but she's like, I am going to make sure people know who we are and what we stand for. So when we moved in, Black Lives Matter sign out front, pride flag hanging off of the balcony. It was, we live here now, and one of the neighbors had a big old Trump flag out front of their house, and he knew us. He was a distant cousin of somebody that was a distant cousin to somebody, because that's just how Nashville is. And so he came up. He was like, "Hey, I heard you guys moved in," and we're like, "Oh, where do you live?" He's like, "Oh, I'm the one with the big Trump flag on the front of the house." And he like looked at the Black Lives Matter sign, like as he said that. And it was like fear, like he had fear saying his own thing, that it was going to create conflict by just saying it. And I said, "Oh, cool. What are you loving about Trump right now?" He's like, "What?" I was like, "What do you love about Trump?" And then he proceeded to tell me, and it was, what I love about that conversation is that the answers are real thin these days. It's he says it how it is. Does he though?
Yeah. Well, and that's an interesting dynamic, because I'm saying it how it is, and they don't
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah.
There's something more to it than that. That's just
Yeah.
the way it comes out. But
Yeah. Yeah. And
yeah,
but that type of curiosity, you come in and you go, like, I don't need to. You already know where I stand. We got the sign out front. You got all that. I can be curious about you, and he can say whatever he wants to say. It could have been the most, it could have been the ugliest thing, right?
yeah,
And it could have been like, oh, okay. But most people don't want to say, they know what's ugly. Again, back to some of that cognitive dissonance. They know
yeah,
that the ugly stuff is ugly. And in that first interaction, when you're being curious and you're like, what do you like about him? They're not going to lead with the stuff that's the ugliest.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But when they're in a battle on Facebook, they're going to take that. They're going to
Oh, okay.
go ugly when you are doubling down and you're
Oh, okay.
fighting back and forth. They're going to go for the ugly thing because they are trying to piss you off to win a battle.
Got it.
Right. And so I think that has its place too. If it's like, hey, let's say the ugly stuff out loud. You're thinking it. So at least now, and the version of that for me is, America first is this, like, that's kind of the nice way of saying some of the stuff that's like, got the ugliest things like tied into it,
Yeah.
and it took he's been campaigning since 2015. It kind of took, I feel like, 7 to 8 years for it to get compiled down into that one phrase of where,
Yeah.
like, well, just America first. And there's so much tied in to
Yeah.
what that means, And so you just go, okay, let's be curious and have civil conversations. And it's fun to be the one to spark and ask the questions. And
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I think would be worth teasing out here, because, a couple layers, but one just specifically to that is, I think one of the things that Republicans have failed utterly, particularly in the last decade, is that they're sort of fighting this culture war, they say, but
Mhm.
the way they're fighting it is actually causing them to lose it.
Oh, I would agree.
They're
Yeah.
actually, like, they're asserting dominance and control, which is losing influence, right?
Yeah.
And I think what you're describing, is something that they're missing. Maybe, I mean,
Yeah.
we're all missing it, but maybe in larger quantities.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think
what would you
so.
say to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, listen, here's the thing. There's a lot of people who agree with Republicans on where they stand in the culture war, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll take abortion as an example. Many, many people do not want people to be getting abortions,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Like, don't agree with abortion, would never get an abortion, but they don't think that the government has the right to dictate what a person can or can't do with their body. And so then you have the anti-vax crowd that says the government can't tell me what to do with my body.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's the same statement. It's literally the same language.
Yeah.
And
And you could add
so,
masks into that too,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And
Whatever
so,
the thing is.
so then you have this, and then cognitive dissonance. You can't say both things. You can't say, oh, the government has a right to tell a woman what she can do with her body, but not me, man, or whatever. You can't say that and use the same language.
It would
And
corrode
not,
into a, yeah.
yeah, at
Yeah.
some point you have to confront, like, oh, I want to be able to tell people what they can do, what you said of dominance. I want to be able to tell people what they can do with their body as far as it's concerned with abortion, because I have a very passionate belief about what abortion is. And but I don't want them to be able to tell me what I can do with my body as it pertains to vaccines, because I have a very passionate opinion about what I believe about vaccines.
Like, I'm a type of person where I want to have sort of the vision and be consistent in that value.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want, if I am like inconsistent in the way you're describing, like, then that bothers me. But I think for a lot of people, maybe that cognitive dissonance doesn't bother them.
Yeah. Now, I wager that it does bother them.
Yeah.
Right. I think it does bother them. And that's why we see such aggression.
Yeah. You're saying the contradiction, they have a hard time with the contradiction, and that comes out in
I
different
don't
weird ways.
think you can hold that level of hypocrisy and contradiction in and it not have a negative consequence. And I think what that negative consequence is rage.
Yeah. But so this would actually be a good example, I think, also what I'm talking about in terms of winning the hearts and minds of people, is that domination approach to abortion is scaring people away from Republicans. Like, whoa, they're trying to control me. And they should be scared. So, but they're thinking, well, if we can just control them, then we can force this on them, and then we don't have any abortions, which isn't actually how it works. And so the way I see it is they're actually driving up the number of abortions through their approach. And
we know that. I mean, we have the data on that.
Yeah. You know? And so what they don't see is they're actually making the issue worse.
Yep.
And this is one of the things for me, like, when it comes to life, valuing the life versus wanting to enact laws. And not that we shouldn't regulate or shouldn't have laws, but there's a limit to the law, and that's where you have to win the hearts and the minds, where the law hits the limit, and then you work on the hearts and the minds. And so it's this weird thing of the thing they're chasing, and this kind of where I guess it comes out for me in terms of like being a Republican in Paris. Is, wait a second, you said this, and this was important. Like, take, for example, Republicans, you know, as far as I grew up, it was about taking responsibility. It was about fidelity to the Constitution. But Trump is the opposite of both of those things. And now the Republican Party is the opposite of those things. They're about blame, and they're about, maybe we don't need the Constitution. Like,
it's wild.
Flipped. Yeah. And so I kind of think of this year as a year of unmasking. Like, what's really underneath it? And for some people, those values may still be there. But for a lot of people, there's something overriding it. And I think there are many reasons for that, and it's different for different people. But, you know, to kind of just connect to some of the things you're saying, like being a Republican for Harris is a very different thing than me just becoming a Democrat. In terms of the tension and dynamic it creates, and kind of thought about that for a while, like, what should I do? And I decided, like, I don't want to be pushed out here.
Right.
So,
and
one of the things Trump actually taught me is he showed me that in 8 years he could transform the party in his image, and there's no reason that couldn't be done again in a different image.
That's correct.
And from my own experience, just consulting with people, coaching people are usually ejected from the system, and they don't stay in it and then change it from the inside out, and which is very difficult. In most cases, it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
There are a few exceptions that I've discovered, but that's been an interesting dynamic, because, like, I'm part of a group, and with the Republicans, they're very like, if you aren't loyal to Trump, you're not a Republican. And it kind of goes back to what you're saying. You're not a Christian. Like, I got that. Exactly. I get that all the time. Jason, you're not a Republican. And they say, well, here's my story. Here's all the people I voted for. And here's all the things. I used to go to the Young Republicans. And, like, responsibility, is that, these values. But they're pushing me out because they don't want me to stay. They want me to leave so that they have their echo chamber, it seems. Or they have their sacred cows. We don't talk about January 6th,
Right. Well, what's funny is that it's the same thing as the term that sheep, right? Like, what you're saying is that the Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party. So you could say that it's Republican in name only, right? So it's a rhino.
Yeah.
But then they're calling you a rhino
Yeah.
because you're not aligning with what the current Republican Party is saying.
It has
So it's the
become,
same
yeah.
thing of like we're all calling each other snowflake. We're all calling each other the same thing. At what
Yeah.
point do you stop and just go, okay, maybe we are the same thing. Maybe we are all snowflakes. Maybe we are all just getting our feelings hurt over and over and over again. And maybe everybody is offended all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, why? Why is that?
Yeah.
And I think it's a lack of empathy. I think it's a lack of curiosity. Empathy has been big on my mind of late, because in your situation of the Republican Party and stuff, like what I hear from you when you're posting, I hear a lot of empathy in your concerns. You're passionate about the Republican Party. I love what you said of like, I don't want to just like eject myself. I'm not becoming a Democrat, right? I'm staying a Republican. And then your advocacy obviously is for the nation as a whole. But I also hear a lot of empathy from you for Republicans who are still underneath the influence of Trump. I think you really are, and I really appreciate it. You really are trying to create a bridge where you can, of just like, hey, I don't want you to change your mind, but I don't want to force you to change your mind. I just want to point these things out. Like, can you hang with this cognitive dissonance, right? Can you stay in it? Like, this is what the Republican Party used to stand for, and now it doesn't. And for the record, I mean, I came up Republican until I voted for McCain against Obama, and then I didn't vote on the second Romney. I didn't vote for Obama or Romney.
Okay.
Just I was on tour and didn't do it right. And then voted for Hillary. You know, in that, and I voted for Bush. Bush was the first
2-8
time. So I've voted for. Oh wait, so I guess I've voted for more Republicans than Democrats.
Yeah.
So, which is funny. So I mean, I think I'm probably a Democrat a lot, but I have criticisms of the Democratic Party for sure, in the sense that it's also got the echo chamber. And there's always going to be extremists, right? There's always going to be people that are extreme and fundamental. And so then when people criticize it's funny, because also here's another thing that happens. Everybody says that like Kamala Harris is far left, right? Oh, she's far left. And then the far left is like, she's basically a Republican. And you're like, what? What are we? Okay.
Which I get that too. Like, I'm either a communist or I'm, whatever. But I think,
so you're just like, okay, well, both of those things can't be true, I don't think. One thing that I'm excited about, and I hope, and I think you and I share this, even amongst, I've heard more Democrats say this than maybe any time before. Pete Buttigieg being the one who says it the most, is that we want a strong and vibrant Republican Party.
Yes.
I want
2 healthy parties, both of them. Yeah.
2 healthy parties, right? Like, I want a strong, well-voiced Republican Party that isn't an authoritarian party. A place where there's good debate happening from a conservative perspective. I want that, and I find myself very moderate in a lot of ways. Like on the abortion topic, when people are like, "Oh, it should be an issue of the states," there's a lot of places where I agree that there are things that are, should be governed by the states. And so when that was the piece that like kicked it back
to the states,
to the states, I was like, this isn't all bad. This isn't all bad.
Yeah.
Now we need some federal guidelines that say this is my belief. Some federal guidelines that govern access so that these nightmare situations that happen and autonomy can be preserved, and the government isn't telling people what to do with their health care. But then the states do have regulatory authority in situations.
I don't know that anyone is saying it shouldn't be regulated. So or very few
exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, like the people say like this politician or that politician has no regulations, and that's actually no. Even Roe had regulations within it, and so most of the Democratic politicians are saying, we want Roe back with the regulations they have. All that to say, what I mean is that I think most Americans have at least one issue that they don't align with the party on.
Yeah.
Right.
Is it more of a matter of like, is there enough of them that just sort of tips the scale?
But what happens is we don't get to talk about those issues at all. And the thing is that when those issues come up, it's like, hey, I think this is for me, I have so many issues that I go, I think these things are problems. And people go, that's not a problem. That's not a problem. And the whataboutism, this is what's actually a problem. And I go, no, that's also a problem. But can we talk about this problem? And then if we actually have the conversation, hey, what do you think we should do about it? That's where people find we actually align. Is like, if we can agree that it's a problem, now let's talk about solutions. And then people find out that my path to fixing a lot of problems isn't what they expected it to be. So sometimes they'll be like, I think the state should handle it, and I don't think it should be federal. And then they're like, are you sure you're a Democrat? I'm like, no, I'm not. You called me that. I didn't call me that. And so that's where it's like, if we can get back to discourse, if we can get back to conversation and being able to talk with each other.
And that's one of the things that I think led to the Trump era. In this, maybe it's both, but I'm a Republican, so I'm speaking from the Republican side.
Yeah.
Dems are bad, Dems are bad, Dems are bad. This was the habit. Dems are bad, Dems are bad. And so, talk radio said that. Everyone said that. When Liz Cheney did the January 6th committee, she was asked to be on it by Nancy Pelosi. So she's working with Nancy Pelosi. And I guess they had a meeting where she shows up and Nancy Pelosi's aide comes to her and says, these are all the 10 terrible things that Liz Cheney said about you. And Nancy Pelosi was like, wise enough to say, that doesn't matter. Get rid of it. Like, it didn't matter. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've seen with Liz Cheney that's and also just her campaigning with Harris is that bridge of like, this isn't actually my enemy. I mean, we have different I think of rival is a better word. Ooh, this is my rival, but we're on the same team in the larger picture. And but I think that kind of the two parties demonizing each other, but as far as I can tell with the Republican Party, it's the Dems are bad habit that kind of distorted us in how we saw things. And the way that I look at it is we actually need each other. Like, we need two healthy parties, and the two healthy parties need each other. Yeah. And what we need is people and leaders that are doing what Cheney and Harris are doing, which is they're working together. I mean, Harris said she was going to have a Republican on her cabinet. I mean, I get emotional thinking about like the idea of a bipartisan White House, and that could just be the starting point. Like, it could, like, imagine
it happened in the West Wing.
Okay, I never saw it, but that sounds like
in the show.
I mean, I kind of had this vision, like, what about like one party is the president, the other is the vice president,
it could happen.
That unity ticket is just really powerful, and I think I just get emotional thinking like these were our president. I loved a lot of the things Obama said at the DNC. Like, I was very moved by some of the things he said. But I've also been discouraged by George W. Bush, who's just been gone the last 10 years in a lot of ways. I know he's doing things like in local ways, and but
he's
from
painting a lot.
Like he's our grandfather. I feel like he's the grandfather that disappeared after he retired, you know?
Yeah.
And so, but I have this sort of vision and hope, like, these people that let us, like, there's an obligation and a duty, I think, that's beyond just their role in the White House, but, you know, and so that leadership vacuum, I think, just generally speaking, is just something that I want to see, and that I want us to have as a country.
Well, I think what you're talking about, you said Dems are bad, Dems are bad, Dems are bad, and take that even a step down, that's even better than what I hear the most, and it's they are bad. They are bad.
Yeah.
And I'm like, who's they? Who is they? Do you mean your neighbor?
Yeah.
Do you, like, they are bad? When we say they are bad, it means that we can eliminate our neighbor if we don't want to include them if they're in the room. Right?
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Like, I don't mean you.
Amorphous.
Well, so who is they? And as you get more specific, it does start to include people that maybe you wouldn't want to include. But when you aren't specific, the person listening can put whoever they want into that space.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. So what we have to actually do is we actually have to start naming who we think are the problems, right? So if you want to, you know, let's take it to this side of the fence, you know, like, they are bad. Okay, who's they? Democrats are bad. You mean all people registered as Democrats are bad? Well, no, not people registered as Democrats are bad. The Democratic politicians are bad.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. The Democratic politicians are bad. All of them? Which ones? Right?
Yes. Yeah.
This one. When you actually do that, when you actually go in and you start ticking away and you start naming them, what's going to happen is somebody's going to go, this Democrat is bad. Nancy Pelosi, we'll just take Nancy Pelosi is bad. If you take that line and you run that line down, you're going to have a lot of Democrats that are going to go, yeah, not a big fan of Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah.
Right? But then you don't get to have your echo chamber anymore.
Yeah. Well, let me give a couple examples too that come to mind. One is I'll use Kamala Harris as an example. But this was kind of earlier this year when it seemed like Biden, the pressure was on Biden. And I had a negative impression of Harris. And I asked myself, why do I have that negative impression of her?
Yeah.
And I thought about it and I said, well, the impression I have is based on all these people that hate her that I heard talk about her. And that's that's all it's based on.
Yeah.
And
never actually listened to her speak.
Yeah, I never listened to her speech. And I've actually been very impressed with her speeches.
Yeah.
She's a very focused person. She's a very disciplined person.
Mm-hmm.
Just how she conducts herself in her campaign is just been incredible to watch for me. Like very things about her I didn't know were there. Maybe she's changed and grown, but it was very compelling for me.
She has, and she just recently posted something that said, did I see the quote from you where she said,
I'm not sure.
Anyways, maybe it was, somebody said, why here were your policies that you campaigned on when you were campaigning,
I did see something. Yeah.
And then,
which I was so grateful because just be honest about, I changed,
she said, I changed because I spent 4 years as the vice president of the United States, which gave me which is a lot different than being a senator of a singular state. And when you go and have conversations with people all across the country, if your position doesn't change after doing that, there's something wrong with you.
Another thing, another example is, so I watched a bunch of her speeches, and every time she talks, whenever she does a speech, for the first 5 minutes, she's just thanking people. So much gratitude. I'm so grateful for this person that did this. Thank you so much. Thank you though. I've never seen someone with such gratitude in that type of a leadership position.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so stark that Trump actually mocked her for why does she always telling people thank you? That's so he kind of diminished it. But it was very striking for me.
Yeah.
And another example is you mentioned Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi's bad. Nancy Pelosi. That's what I always heard. I have never actually I never heard an interview with Nancy Pelosi until this year.
Yeah.
Like an actual interview where she's talking and I'm listening. Like that was the first time I've ever done that.
Yep.
And so this echo chamber idea, like we have to, I think part of it is we want to be in that echo chamber. So we have to want to get out of it.
Yeah.
We have to want to, and this could go both ways. And so, there's stereotypes that kind of, and exceptions, and those skew how we see things. Yep. But I think it's something we have to want. And I guess that's what I hope for America. And I hope in our leadership who will model it is that, we like Harris being an example, like I'm going to have a Republican in my cabinet. That's a choice to have an environment that doesn't have this echo chamber, right?
That's correct.
And that's a huge deal. Like, I know it's, it's just
inviting in voices that you're going to disagree with.
Yeah. And I think that's so powerful because for me, I'm, as I've grown and changed, I want strength for me is not steel manning. It's the best argument and counter argument coming together to discover the best integration of both.
Yeah,
the best. I don't want a flimsy one-sided argument that wins a debate. I want what's the strongest thing. I want what's true, and what's good.
Or a gotcha moment. I think the funniest criticism of Harris is when people go, she doesn't answer any questions. And she's like, no, she doesn't answer the loaded questions, right? Like it was a loaded question. She's a lawyer. She knew how to not get caught in the gotcha moment. And so let's get back to some journalism. And stop asking loaded questions, right?
Well,
to get the soundbite for the
back to your point about the whole they thing. I mean, part of me wants to go, well, what have you actually watched? Like, have you watched one clip of one interview? Like, have you watched a whole interview? Have you watched her speeches?
Yeah.
I see people say stuff, and it feels like Chat GPT giving this shallow answer that doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yep.
And I feel like a lot of people are like, they're just regurgitating things.
Yeah.
They actually haven't done their work.
Yeah, to your point of like you have to get out of the echo chamber. I think that we can be more proactive though too. We can't expect people to come out of the echo chamber because the echo chamber is their safety. So I think that we can be more proactive to get ourselves invited into spaces where our voices are able to be heard. And one of the ways that I do that is I say, hey, if you believe that the 2020 election was stolen, I'm not going to try and tell you it wasn't. You've got your information, you've got your data. I don't believe that it was, but whatever you've looked at or whoever you're listening to, you're convinced that it was stolen. Okay. Then you absolutely should be voting for Trump.
Yeah.
That's it. If you believe it was stolen, you absolutely should be voting for Trump. Right? If you believe XYZ about it, like if you've heard this information and you believe it, then I understand why you're making the decisions that you're making.
Cognitive
empathy. And that's empathy and affirmation. And that's the part where part of an echo chamber is also the echo of what you expect opposing voices to say. You expect them to say, how could you believe that?
Yeah.
Hey, listen, if you believe it, you believe it. Somebody you trust told you.
Trying to be the exception, be
who's
different than their expectation. Yeah.
The person who believes it's not my enemy. The person who lied to somebody about it is my enemy. The person who betrayed my friend's trust and now they believe that the government is controlling hurricanes. That is it's not the person that believes that, right? Like the person who believes that the government is controlling hurricanes is absolutely not my enemy. It's whoever they trusted that told them that
lied to them. Yeah.
So why am I coming in being like, are you an idiot? Like I'm coming in going, where did you get this information? Like, oh, I got it from
here. Who told you that?
I'm going, okay, why do you trust that person? And staying curious. Why do you trust that person? Oh, because here's all the things that they said. And what it always boils down to, and this comes back to one of the, we might start being an echo chamber here, but one of the things is it comes back to fear. I think most of the time is that somebody's scared of something.
Yeah.
They've got this cognitive dissonance that they go, I'm scared. This person's making me feel safe. And that's what we were talking about. Something is giving them the feeling of safety in a time that they're feeling fear. And so then when you come in and you try to eliminate that thing, you're eliminating their safety. And I don't think we operate with enough awareness around that. And so we have to come in and we have to provide safety before we take away something that is giving safety. And so that's what curiosity looks like. So when you ask somebody, hey, why do you believe that? Where'd you get that information? Oh, I got it from this trusted source who has made me feel safe in all these other places where I've felt fear.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand why you trust that person.
Yeah.
If I were scared of those things, if that was my biggest fear, I'd probably trust them too. If I believed the rhetoric that Trump grabs and hangs on to, if I believed it, I would be pretty excited about Trump as president.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so it's fear mongering at its finest. And so you can't fight fear mongering.
Yeah. One of the things I wrote about and published was, when I first moved to Atlanta, I was in over my head and I felt that anxiety and fear. And when those toxic people came around, they helped me they helped me feel safe. And I was exploited because of it. But there was a symbiotic dynamic there because I was also feeling safe.
That's right.
So it's hard to overcome that without actually healing and growing through our own trauma that we have.
Yeah.
And wounds and pain.
Yep.
But yeah, that echo chamber, voluntarily, inviting. I think so. You say, like going into those places, and then I think you can create context where you invite that. Yeah. I've been working on this book called From the Garden to the Cross, and I got 4 people, and we did an episode podcast for each chapter.
Cool.
And for one of the chapters, I invited a Jewish friend of mine.
Yeah.
And another, I invited an atheist.
Yeah.
And so they're part of those conversations, and it was a really interesting, it adds a different, like you said, boring. It adds another interesting layer.
Correct.
And I'm not threatened, I know some people might be, and it is a little bit scary if you're not used to that kind of thing, but I was excited about it and I loved it. So
it's that's what we have to be doing. And I think that's the piece, is coming into spaces. And when we come in with curiosity, if you come in and you ask questions of somebody, they like answering them, right? So if you come in and you ask questions and you're curious, it'll be an hour-long conversation and they might not ever ask you anything about yourself. And so then when they go, yeah, well, what about you? You go, oh, here's everything about me. And they go, shoot, I really liked this guy for the last hour when he was curious about me, but now he believes all these things that are different than me. And then when you show that, oh, maybe he was judging me for my answers. No, I wasn't judging you for your answers.
Yeah.
There's a quote that I heard from Pete Holmes, but it's not his quote. I heard it on his podcast.
Okay.
Not his quote, but I don't remember who it was. But he says, if I were them, I'd be them.
Yeah.
And it's my favorite of just, if I lived the experiences that they experience, I would be exactly how they are and who they are. So, that's
I think that's a really helpful thing. Yeah. And it's for like when you think about, I think when we feel like we're superior to somebody else, that's a great thing to remember is, you know what? We're not. We're the same. We might think we're a little bit better. But
that person is the way they are because of all the things that have happened. And if all the things that had happened to them happened to you exactly the same, you'd be exactly.
Yeah. And I actually, that's one of the things I've thought about just in terms of January 6th. Like, I could have been Ashley Babbitt, who's the lady that was shot that could have been me, right? I went through a stint of being radicalized in 2006. It was the pre-Trump era. It was a lot milder than it is now. But if it was now, if it was then, with 2020, it could have been me. I could have been climbing over that window, like.
Right.
And I think that's just a really important thing. And I think, kind of back to your point about, like, I don't want, and this is even my fear for, like, this year, like when January 6th 2.0 happens, I don't want my friends and family involved in that. I want them to stay home. I don't want the consequences that would come with that participation.
Yep.
And so part of why I'm speaking out is because, I don't want them to be a part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it, man.
Yeah.
I think my child's about to walk in.
Yeah. Well, any last word for you, and we'll wrap it up here?
I hope to have more conversations like this, and I hope that people will listen and disagree vibrantly and then talk about it,
Yeah, no, that's good. I'll just leave us with one little quick story that I always wanted to do jury duty, and every time I've done it, I've gotten a little bit farther in the process, but I've never been in the courtroom. But I had this one experience where I was called, and we were all, like, picked, and we were about to go in the courtroom, and it was resolved before we went in.
Yeah.
And the court personnel came over and said, I know it feels like you just wasted your whole day, but you all just sitting here made a difference. It created a tension between the prosecutor and the defense to actually negotiate a deal. And that was pretty powerful, just to realize that, kind of like we've talked about, just standing in the gap, and it could even be silently, just being there. Just with that pin. It could be that pin on your backpack, or a post you do on social, or a thing you say. That could make the difference. And so yeah, that's my final story.
I dig it. Man, it's good to chat.
Yeah, you too. Talk to you later.
See ya.